I'm continuing my preview of the Anand Carlsen World Championship match that will take place in Chennai in India in November. Now, in the first clip, you'll remember that I showed you a game where Anand defeated Carlsen in their first classical game. And this next game I'd like to show you is from that same tournament, Morelia, Linares 2007. It was a double round robin tournament. So for this second game, Anand has the white pieces, and in these early days of their encounters, Carlsen did not have an easy time against Anand. Carlsen was just 16 years old, but already he had a rating of 2690. Now, we join the game, and it's a Spanish, it's a mainline Spanish. I want to get to the critical middle game position, so I know a lot of you like to see the whole game, so let me just go through these first very theoretical moves very, very quickly. But this is mainline Spanish, and now, well, Queen c7 is the so-called Chigorin variation. There are many ways to play this for black, but Carlsen selected knight d7, which has a reasonable reputation. Now, why knight d7? Well, first of all, of course, that knight defends the e5 pawn, but it also is able to swing round to the queen side to create counterplay, but also it creates a square for the bishop to come to f6 under certain circumstances to put pressure through to the pawn on d4. Now, white has many ways to play this position. You could play, for example, knight d2, and this would be very standard, just to keep the tension in the center, and later on to do this classic Spanish maneuver around here. That's one way of playing. You could also try and play a4, there's b3, but okay, today Anand played d5. I say today, this was in 2007. d5, so closing the centre straight away. Now, this is a very committal decision. Now, there are pros and cons to this move. It takes the pressure off black as far as e5 goes, and it also, well, it resolves the tension in the centre, so black can plan a lot better in some ways. White always has to watch out for f5 now, this standard break, a bit like a King's Indian. But on the plus side for white, the move d5 gains a lot of space, and as is so typical for many Spanish positions, this knight on a5 is left a little bit out of play for the moment, at any rate. Okay, let's see how the game develops. So knight b6, well, that seems sensible to regroup to free the bishop. And white continues with this very standard maneuver, possibly bringing the knight around to the kingside. But one thing is, you always have to watch out for this break f5. And this has been played in several games, but in this case, I think this gives white a very pleasant position. You can see that, well, there's nothing really happening on the f-file, and this knight is a beautiful blockader on e4. Very nice position for white. Instead, Carlsen played g6. Now, this is a preparatory move. When you play f5, it means you can recapture with the g pawn, and that makes a massive difference. You control the e4 square. Now, Anand could play with knight f1 and allow this break, and then we'll hope to gain play on the king side. I mean, that is possible. But instead, he played b4 and tried to stir things up on the queen side straight away. Now, this does allow the knight back into play, but what he's doing with this is initiating play on the queen side, hoping to distract black from his king side play. And it also means, well, you can see that that knight has disappeared, and it means that this bishop can very easily come into the game. So there are pros and cons to this move. Bishop b3. Now, this turns out to be a very good move indeed. Now, possibly Carlsen didn't play as accurately as he might in this position. First of all, let's look at this move f5. I think in every position, white has to consider this move f5. Now, I don't think it's a very good move in this position, but let's take a look why. Well, white would exchange on c4 and play the bishop out. These moves are very natural, and just play rook c1, and the pawn is in big trouble. And again, there's no real threats on the f file. For example, if takes, well, you could just play rook takes there actually, and there's nothing happening. So let's go back to the position here. So after bishop b3, so Carlsen was clearly worried about this move, bishop takes knight. Now possibly he should have played bishop d7 here anyway, and tried to hold on to that pawn. But instead he retreated the knight, and I think from this moment on Anand plays superbly. Bishop e3, so just targeting that knight. Well, if it doesn't want to stay on c4, then it has a bit of a problem. You can see it doesn't have a support here in this position. So bishop e3 is a nice move. And well, let's look at f5 again, and this shows the kind of tactics that arise after the bishop has come to b3. So we're going to take on e5, and we're exploiting the position of bishop and king. So if that's taken, then obviously d6 check is rather embarrassing. And we're going to see lots more tactics involving that bishop on b3. So bishop d7 played, and Anand occupies the c file. So Carlsen opposes, and Anand occupies the c file again, and rook c1 is an excellent move. This just means that Carlsen is rather stuck for the moment. Carlsen would like to be able to play queen b8 and rook c8 just to neutralise the pressure, but actually this is already winning material. This is very embarrassing indeed. After this, and takes, white wins material in a very simple way. So Carlsen was forced to put his knight back on a8, very uncomfortable indeed, to protect the c7 square. Now white can't go any further on the queen side, but instead Anand turns his attention to the king side. This is what you can do when you have a space advantage. You can switch your play from side to side very, very easily. It means your greater space gives you greater maneuverability. And well, Anand notes that if f6 here, which would prevent white's next move, we'll see what happens in a second, then he'd planned the idea knight e1 with the idea knight d3 to c5, and again exploiting this position of bishop and king. Of course the king could come to g7, well perhaps not g7 because of bishop h6, let's say king h8, but knight d3 and knight c5 anyway becomes a possibility, because after black takes, then white would have two stomping pawns through the middle of the board. Queen b8 from Carlsen. Okay, now he is trying to neutralise the pressure on the queen side, and then he'll be able to bring his knight back into play. Sometimes you can even play bishop d8 to support the knight coming back, or exchange bishops. And this is where Anand plays this very tricky move, bishop g5. It's a very provocative move, this. Black has several responses to this, but none of them are completely clear. Well, first of all, if f6, once again we can exploit the rather sensitive position of bishop and king, and also here. These pins are absolutely horrible for black. Knight e5 is a beautiful move. So Carlsen exchanged on g5, and this knight suddenly starts to look rather menacing. You can see if the knight is driven away straight away, then knight e6. Again, this funny position of bishop and king, and this is really strong because bishop is attacked, and if it moves then it's e7 and queen h6 as well. Very nasty indeed. So now possibly Carlsen should try king g7, but then f4, again a very typical pawn break in the Spanish to keep things going on the king side, and certainly Anand has a strong initiative there, but that might be best for black. Carlsen played rook c8, which seems very normal to neutralise the pressure. And Anand's next move is rather remarkable. If you exchange, then I think it's going to be difficult for white to generate an initiative with so few pieces. But instead, Anand gave up the c-file but switched to the kingside. It's a very strong move because f4 is coming, and actually Carlsen is going to miss the fact that the rook is defending on the f-file. f4 is going to be very strong indeed. For example, queen c7, f4, black doesn't have enough time to exchange queens because there are problems on the f-file here. Carlsen played h6. I think he has a very difficult position here already, and he probably saw this move, but there wasn't much he could do about it. Knight e6 is really strong indeed. So we want to play queen h6. That's one simple threat, and if this is taken, well, white's initiative is just fantastic. So 2 pawns for the piece. Now you can see with black's pieces stuck on the other side of the board, this has to be a winning attack. For example, here, and after f4 the rook comes into the game and it's going to be all over. So after knight e6, Carlsen just defended the pawn with his king, and f4 anyway. So Carlsen is trying to perhaps bring his queen into the defence. Now, Carlsen played bishop e8 here, but let me show you a beautiful variation that Anand demonstrated later. What happens if this piece is taken again? Okay, the bishop has to retreat, and that covers f7. Otherwise a rook invasion would take place, but these pawns are storming down the board. Now Anand calculated a very long line here, and this is fantastic. Now I think f6, f7 is a very clear threat, so black could try to exchange queens. And now watch, this is Anand's analysis during the game. So the knight has to come back into play. Now these moves are all forced. The bishop has to take, otherwise a queen threatened. Now black would like to play knight c4, blocking out the bishop, so bishop e6. The knight comes into play. I mean, these moves are more or less forced. I mean, black does have alternatives, but they're all losing. So the knight comes across to take the pawn. Now here you might think, well, white could take and go a pawn up in a rook and pawn ending, but that's not so clear. But there's a very clear win here, which Anand had seen during the game. This is forced. And after this, because of the pin, black has to play king g7, and now white can exchange off, and white wins this ending. It takes just a glance for an experienced player to see that this is a completely winning king and pawn ending for white. You create an outside pass pawn, and the king heads over here and wins. Let's just see how this might work in practice. So the king comes over, you create a pass pawn, you distract black's king, and white is just in time to win. Basically the king will scoop up the pawns, and that's winning. So I imagine Anand got to this position, and well, you can see this is a clear win for white. But that is an impressive piece of calculation. Anand was really at his height in 2007, the height of his powers. Bishop e8 played, and the pawn stomps on. Now taking the knight would transpose to that last variation. Now f6, threatened by white, will just box in the king, and that'll be the end. So black has to play f6. At least that creates a bit of communication between the queen and the king side, but well, now white is left with this monstrous piece, this beast on e6. What a piece, absolutely superb. Like an octopus with these 8 arms controlling so many important squares. And now it's just a case of bringing the pieces into the attack. Rook e1 with the threat of bringing the rook up here. If rook f3, then the rook, well, this is still good for white, but not as convincing as rook e1. Now, let me just show you one variation with knight b6. Then the rook would swing across, and now knight f8. And the reason I'm showing you this variation is that white wins in a very typical way. After rook g7 check, bishop f7, and now you win the queen across the other side of the board with this skewer. Very typical. So instead knight c7, and now, well, after rook e4, h5, still good for white, but perhaps not so clear. So Anand instead played rook to c1 to pin, which brought the bishop here, and then he switched over to the king side, and this is the most convincing. And let's just see how the game ended. So threat of rook g7 check and queen h6 mate. This was exchanged, and now a nice win. e7, opening up the line of the bishop to g8. And after queen takes d6, Carlsen actually resigned. Well, you can see it's all over after this. And once again, this move bishop g8 is absolutely crushing, winning the queen and checkmating very shortly. So a really convincing victory from Anand there from 2007. In that tournament, actually Anand won with 8.5 out of 14. Carlsen was actually second equal with 7.5, which for a 16-year-old was a pretty remarkable achievement. He was already very strong indeed, but at this stage in 2007, Anand was clearly the superior player.